So good morning everyone, thank you very much for being here and listening to us, and thanks to Francis and also to Julia Sinclair, as well as the organising committee for inviting us to give our perspective regarding addiction, stigma and mental health services. So I'm Max, as you've heard, and this is Rosy, and we're here today to describe our experience of stigmatisation by telling you about George, my best friend and Rosy's brother. We're also here to represent George's parents, Alison and Mark, who sadly can't be here today, but are also strongly fighting addiction stigma in the mental health services. As I said, we're hugely thankful to the organisers of this conference for giving us the opportunity to tell George's story, and we hope that important lessons can be learned and steps taken to prevent something like that happening again. I have to say that when I'd seen George last 3 years ago, he predicted that I'd be stood here with Rosy addressing a room full of distinguished professionals, he probably would have laughed, and so would I. But thank you very much.
So we're here to tell George's story. George is one of the 2,598 people recorded to have died from drug misuse in England and Wales in 2016. By this point, George had been using heroin on and off for around 2 years, but was doing everything that was in his power to become clean again. So this is George and I on his graduation day from Goldsmiths University in London, taken less than a year before he died. He had achieved a very good degree in English and was actually planning on returning to university to pursue a master's in writing.
And as you can see, this was us on George's 18th birthday. It was a really happy day. George was a very highly talented musician and poet and was loved by many people. But like many substance misusers, he was plagued by depression and anxiety, in his case since the age of about 14 years old. The provision of adolescent psychiatric services was very limited.
George became addicted to heroin whilst at university, when access to psychology and psychiatric services became even more challenging. He was persuaded to seek help, and he engaged well with the substance misuse services. So he took it upon himself to seek help, and was very much supported by his parents, family and friends. But if you're a heroin addict, you remain very much stigmatised by almost everyone else. So what we want to ask you is, how can this still be the case?
Now, obviously, stigmatisation is underpinned by the fact that here in the UK, the current law states that taking Class A drugs is illegal. The same attitudes used to apply to LGBT individuals prior to decriminalisation, and in some societies still does. You may have seen the protests over Brunei lately. However, over 70% of drug addicts have diagnosable mental health conditions. It has to be remembered that addicts are still people and have human rights to proper treatment, just like anybody else does. Addiction has the power to take over any individual at any time. However, common and historic perceptions of those who fall victim to complex relationships with drugs can stigmatise those individuals further. This can be exacerbated by hugely unhelpful, yet again exceptionally common, derogatory terms such as druggie, junkie, smackhead.
George was a casualty of the fact that substance misuse services, which are commissioned by local authorities, are disconnected from NHS mental health services. His mental health issues were not addressed within the substance misuse services, and so he took it upon himself again to seek help, but this time in the mental health services. This is what he wrote in his application for mental health service support. He was asked to write a list of reasons why he was asking for help, which included extremely low mood, constant irritability, the inability to function and leave the house daily, suicidal ideation, and high-risk drug taking.
As you can see, and I'm sure you'd agree, he was completely open and honest in his application. But if you're depressed, often the last thing you'd want to do is fill out a form and bare your soul in such an impersonal and clinical way. You just want help. George was reducing his dose of buprenorphine or Subutex because he didn't want to be an addict. He was, as he admitted to the both of us, ashamed of himself. He had come to recognise and accept that he had depression and that required treatment. which in itself was a big step in the right direction.
When asked if there was anything important that he should disclose on his self-application form, George noted that he suffered from all of the problems listed previously, regardless of whether he took drugs or not. When asked what type of help he would like to receive, George answered CBT, psychotherapy, anything. It should have been clear to anyone that he was desperate for help.
Following his self-referral, George received a letter which contained the following advice should he feel he was in a crisis. He did seek help from his GP, who, supportive though she was, like most junior doctors, was unqualified to deal with severe and complex mental health issues. In addition, for anyone who has ever had to attend A&E, I'm sure you'd agree the experience would be enough to cause depression, let alone alleviate it. Even the act of leaving the house to attend a busy hospital can be hugely daunting when you're in such a vulnerable state of mind. Unfortunately, despite George's best efforts, his application for mental health services was rejected out of hand.
The letter of advice that he received could be described as best to have kept him at arm's length. The letter provided no contact details to which George could direct any further questions, of which he had many. At George's inquest, it emerged that he had received 2 phone calls on consecutive days from a withheld number that left no message. Supposedly, the phone call was to explain the reasons behind his rejection, but because he didn't pick up, the letter was sent instead. Now, as a vulnerable person trying to avoid the temptation of dealers, it really shouldn't take a scientist to work out that a person in that situation is not going to answer an anonymous phone call.
As a result of reading the letter, on the basis of it, George had been led to believe that he had to be off buprenorphine or Subutex for 6 months before being granted mental health support. He told me this at the time, and while I was shocked, I didn't really know enough to challenge it, and I regret that. George was devastated by this response, but it did make him determined to cease taking the drug, buprenorphine, which would have protected him from street heroin, in order for him to be accepted for such services. Upon ceasing his medication, he was then subsequently discharged from the drug addiction services as he was deemed to be clean. Again, he felt rejected, he felt alone, and he felt ashamed of himself. Upon receiving his letter, his rejection letter, we later discovered that it was the trigger for George to write his will.
This rejection without any real alternative sent George on the trajectory to his death, which occurred 3 months later. George should have been offered access to mental health services, but he was not. There was a callous disregard for his needs, and he was treated in such a way that he was left with feelings of despair and total uselessness. As I'm sure some of you here may well agree, the letter he receives suggests that he was even stigmatised by those involved with the screening of his application for IACT services. His depression was not controlled because he was denied access to formal mental health services. And as Max said, in response to the letter he received, he was no longer taking Subutex, which would have prevented him from taking street heroin.
So George was feeling vulnerable, he was unstable in his thought process, and while at times he felt positive, other times he felt bleak about his current situation and what the future had in store for him. He had previously admitted that while he was getting better at not using street heroin, he was not totally able to resist its euphoric effects, which added to him feeling ashamed and guilty, and obviously meant he needed support.
However, George didn't want to return to the addiction services, as it would mean, from his understanding based on the information given to him, that he would then be disallowed access to mental health services. And on this basis, he also rejected admission for rehabilitation. Dealers continued to try and contact him, so there was a huge temptation for a person as vulnerable as he was. His family and friends were in regular contact with him to try and protect him from this temptation, but informal support can only go so far.
Now, George did attend private psychotherapy sessions thanks to the support of his family, but it's important to note that, we understand that many, many people in this situation will not be as lucky as that. However, the rules of engagement between patient and therapist, once they pass the age of 18 years old, leaves one powerless to support one's children, even if they are at risk of dying. On the evening of George's death, he did not attend his psychotherapy appointment. If he had gone to the appointment, or if his mother or his girlfriend had known he did not and had phoned him, the outcome could have been very different.
His girlfriend found him the next day after he failed to answer phone calls from his mother. Unfortunately, the stigmatisation didn't even end here, as there was further stigmatisation from the police. Whilst we regarded George's passing as the unlawful death of a mentally ill and vulnerable person, the police regarded him as a criminal, and therefore not worthy of any further investigation. The police could have tracked down the dealers that sold him the heroin that eventually killed him. His phone, now in our care, continued to receive messages which were clearly from dealers.
Now, while there is increasing recognition, including from the Police Federation, that prohibition and criminalisation of addicts is ineffective and requires urgent review, George should not have been stigmatised, but he was, and he felt it keenly. We and his parents are very proud of him, but we're certainly not so proud of the way the institutions treated him. George's inquest transformed into something of a blame game, with the various institutions who at one time or another had him in their care, stating that they were under the impression that he was being cared for somewhere else. Even by the time of the inquest, small considerations that we've mentioned already had not been taken into account by the authorities on all sides, including whether a vulnerable, depressed individual who was trying to avoid temptation from dealers would feel confident answering a withheld phone call without any indication of who was calling him. He was passed between services, which had no channels of communication amongst themselves. If he was rejected or discharged from a service, those who referred him were not informed, and it appeared to us that no one felt accountable for him or his level of care. It's clear he was stigmatised, and as a consequence, he fell through a very large gap in what we perceive to be an exceptionally inefficient system.
So what we are hoping for, with your help, is to tackle head-on the issue of addiction stigmatisation within the mental health services and change what is immediately changeable. Simple things, such as a point of contact on all correspondence to which questions can be directed, calling from recognisable phone numbers or leaving a voicemail where appropriate, and hugely importantly, open channels of communication between services which individuals are passed through could ensure that there's no possible gap for someone like my brother to just slip through. These, to us, perhaps naively, but they seem like small, simple things that could save lives. We want George's story to be one of the last of its kind. His death was preventable. And our aim now is to try to prevent further needless death where we can.
So that sort of brings us to a close. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to us. And we're going to leave you with some of George's own words in the will that we mentioned earlier that he wrote after receiving his rejection letter.
I did what I could, I tried my best, and I hope that you can all forgive me for anything that I may have done to hurt you. I promise that none of it was ever meant.
Never let the bastards drag you down. Never ignore your heart, listen to your soul, and laugh in revolt at the absurdity of this ridiculous rock that we live on. Thank you.
Thank you.